In November 1983, the world's media attention would be focused on one of history's most high-profile kidnapping for ransom cases. Freddie Heineken, yes as in the beer, and his chauffeur were kidnapped in Amsterdam. They would both be discovered by the police in one piece after a ransom of, in current terms, 16 million euros was paid. Ultimately, the 5 Dutch kidnappers were all caught and served prison terms. Only a smidge under half the cash ransom was ever recovered. 4 months prior, in a location 19,000 kilometres away, North Otago, New Zealand, a relative backwater in comparison to the European red lights and bohemian cafes, a very similar crime occurred, right down to the barn being used for the hostage imprisonment. This is the lesser-known story of the Gloria Kong kidnapping, a crime New Zealand has largely forgotten, but at the time made bloods boil, a rare type of crime that would resurface in New Zealand 2 decades later. One of the most difficult crimes to commit successfully is kidnapping for ransom. In the total scheme of things, the physical kidnapping and restraining of your target is comparatively the easy bit. Even if it goes to plan, you are stuck with a victim or victims with no guarantee they will be compliant. They could even become immediately uncooperative and throw a spanner in the works, or in some cases, over-compliant, thus losing the intimidation factor. The anxious victim's family are invariably faced with having to reluctantly deal with anonymous criminals desperate enough to undertake a crime of this nature. Not exactly a great CV in terms of trustworthiness. Knowing full well you may well pay the ransom and follow instructions to the letter and still face the kidnappers killing their major witness. Follow this one to the end and you'll see a New Zealand kidnapping case from 2017 that ended in just such a tragedy. Back in 1960, the case of 8-year-old Sydney schoolboy Graham Thorne made the headlines. That case sent shivers down the spines of New Zealanders as well. It was too close for comfort. Although extremely rare, New Zealand hasn't been exempt from kidnapping for ransom cases as well. And before I get to those details, it's prudent to indicate I'm referring to just extortion cases as opposed to abductions like custody disputes, criminal rivalries or carjackings gone wrong. The first real case of kidnapping I found went right back to 1867 and refers to this married gentleman on your screen by the name of Taupo. In 1862 he had had a visitation from the angel Gabriel, who was bored at that stage, respectively descending upon Joseph Smith's bedroom and helping him write the Mormon Bible. Gabe revealed to Taupo that Mary are the lost tribe of Israel, and it was his job to drive the European heathens from the shores of New Zealand. This is a very abridged version of his background. I'll be sure to do a video on his life at some point. Anyway, Taupo had believers in his independence cause, and they were fittingly called Huhu, H-A-U, translating broadly to stab and strike someone. Picture an early version of the Kenyan Mau Maus. A reminder to never mix extreme strains of religion with nationalism in your garage at home. Even though their leader was now dead, the balloon was slowly losing air. The Huhu kidnapped 2 identified settlers and demanded a ransom of £150 each. Never did find out what happened to that one. Skip a good century plus to Oamaru in the South Island, a town of just 15,000 at that time. Add to that, in the local district, you'd probably get to around 25,000 in 83. This demographic will turn out to be a significant factor in this case, as it was immediately reasonable to presume the perpetrators were locals. In the early evening of Wednesday the 29th of June 1983, 3 masked and armed men burst into the house of Chinese market gardener Jimmy Kong on the outskirts of Oamaru. Besides Mr. and Mrs. Kong and their daughter Gloria, 3 other relatives were in the house. After robbing the house and its occupants and tying up all the other 5 members of the family, the intruders left with 14-year-old Gloria in the family's car. That car would be later found about 2 kilometres away. Mr. and Mrs. Kong were hardly what one would term extravagant millionaires. Spud farmers wouldn't make the top 1,000 rich list in any major city. The kidnapper's demands also tended to reflect they too also viewed him as being a big fish in a small pond. 120,000 New Zealand dollars was the call the family received shortly after the home invasion and kidnapping. One of the 5 calls that would be made, including instructions as to the handover. To put that amount in context, in 1983 the average wage in New Zealand was around $25,000. The 3 armed male intruders would also have to share the loot with a 4th female partner in crime, her job being to guard and look after Gloria. The foursome were now all taking risks, doing time for 5 to 15 years in the clink for a bit over a year's average income. The ransom demands were all made over the phone, some to associates or family members rather than to the actual house. And that one was being tapped, and it would only take one of those ransom calls to lead to their downfall. And as often happens, the more people you bring in on a serious crime venture, the greater the risk one will blabber to his bit on the side or mate at the pub, become jittery and then hold their hands up. When the heat gets turned up, turn on their compatriots in exchange for a lighter sentence. The latter was to occur here. The criminals had made it clear to the Kongs not to contact the police, which of course they ignored, and an investigation began, employing detectives from outside the town, chiefly Christchurch and Wellington. This was uncharted territory for them. The safety of the schoolgirl was paramount. A precedent was about to be enacted. New Zealand police asked the media not to publicise the crime, make the kidnappers believe the Kongs had kept stum and not told the coppers. And they were successful. Nothing reached the papers or airwaves. They managed to buy themselves some time. Police did brief the media nonetheless on all the developments, knowing, rightfully as it would transpire, later on they might need them. Meanwhile, a terrified Gloria was bound and gagged not far from the family house. After being transferred from the family car to a second vehicle, she was unceremoniously stuffed into a cupboard in an Oamaru house, then transferred to the bathroom where she was trussed up in the bathtub. A day and a bit into the deal, she was transferred to a rural farm and left alone. I'm thinking either because the kidnappers believed it was secure enough, or they were now having second thoughts. A freezing Gloria freed herself from her bindings and in the morning made her way to the neighbouring farm and called her relieved parents. The iconic front page photos of father Jimmy being reunited with his daughter remain poignant to this day, still resonate and close to 4 decades later. The cat was now obviously out of the bag. It was front page news. A nationwide groundswell of anger spilt forth. This was one of those moments in time when revulsed Kiwis up and down the country would justifiably saying crimes like this don't happen in New Zealand. Well, now they did. Much was made of the possibility of Gloria Kong being left to die, alone in that barn. The loudest outrage beat of the drums emanated in the region of the crime, North Otago. Find those pricks. The now well-armed with intel media was set loose. 30 police were allocated to the case and they set up cordons and went house to house seeking information. Police were soon inundated with names of possible suspects, and when they broadcasted the recorded voice of the kidnapper making the demands of the Kongs, more than one suggested it was the same man that had made the call. Bingo! David Larnack. Small-town familiarity also went further and bit the crims in the arse when locals said he was best mates with Paul George. 11 days after Gloria's return, the cuffs were on those two. Both would turn star witnesses for the Crown to save their own skins. From what I've read about the trial, the defence lambasted their credibility, which, using Occam's razor, would tend one to think this wasn't the first encounter with Mr. Plod. I stand, however, to be corrected on that. 2 down and 2 to go. One of those was already on the police's radar, Paul McFellin. McFellin had acted suspiciously when detectives had knocked on his door earlier in the inquiry. What about the woman who acted as the guard? McFellin had a sister, Karen. They were both in on the plan which Larnack and George had outlined to the police. They had put a lot of planning into. Clearly not much mental energy though. Paul McPhillan was the mastermind, they said, in the loosest tense of the word. 13 days after her escape, the McPhillans were both now in custody. In April the following year, 1984, the judge at the High Court in Auckland handed down the following sentences to the brother and sister. Larnack and George had already been tried and sentenced earlier. A salutary lesson, if ever you needed one, that never to trust anyone with a Christian name Paul, especially on YouTube history channels. Dodgy as. Speaking of which, before I get to the modern day kidnappings, this is what I want to tempt you with in terms of my bags of lollies. Lollies are just a metaphor, get over it. Mix an Old Testament passage, a passing British pastor in the 80s, the destruction of Taupo, and wait for it, Sir Cliff Richard, and you've got a good hoot of a story. All true, apart from the bits I made up. Presently it lies overgrown, a sideline from YouTube's promos, as I had the misfortune to include amongst the content a crime against humanity, one of Cliff Richard's songs. And sadly, no aliens in this one. For those who need to go south a smidge, take a look at all the pyramids the creatures from the planet Krypton built on the southernmost continent. If they'd left a 5,000-year-old microbrewery, you'd have a believer in me. Links for both of those below. Commercials are now over. Fear not, the subject still has legs. You would think that with the advent of DNA, a cell phone tracking and the proliferation of CCTV videos, kidnapping for ransom would be a thing of the past. Yet in the early 2000s, Auckland had a number that made the news, and doubtless some that were resolved without police, the victims paying up and shutting up. That rash was confined to the Asian community. For the benefit of overseas viewers, I'm referring to Chinese immigrants mostly, who now make up about 10% of Auckland's population. Here are some of the ones I've come across. 2003, 2005, 2008. And then in 2017 we had one that went really wrong. The victim, Jahindarad Putsaporn, was bundled into the car by headhunters, gang members contracted by some Cambodian underworld characters. That's them all in court. I'm sure you can deduce who is part of which group. In short, although bound and gagged, Jahindarad used her legs to kick open the boot of the car and make her escape. Given the situation, she rolled the dice, weighed up her options, and jumped from the moving car. Sadly, she died from her injuries. That motley crew faced a mixture of manslaughter and kidnapping charges. 6 would be convicted and will now still be looking at striped sunlight as we talk. Just when Auckland's of Chinese descent thought it was safe to go back into the water, lo and behold, 18 months ago, in 2020, Asian criminals had gone into the game of organising elaborate kidnapping scams, sending demands to overseas relatives on the false pretences they have their New Zealand son or daughter in their possession in a strange country. A foreign place where only 10% have Mandarin as their first language, and where $100 and a quick-fire 5-word greeting via Western Union wouldn't cut the mustard. In terms of this crime, the scope of the criminals has increased. They've got more creative. And in case you thought for one second I'd forgotten about the highest profile case of kidnapping to ever occur in New Zealand, baby Kahu, the $3 million ransom for the abducted 8-month-old Kahu jury in 2002. Clearly I haven't, have I? I was simply pondering if I should make a separate video on that crime. Put it to one side, hoping you wouldn't spot where I'd hidden it, in between the albums of Deep Purple in rock and Made in Japan. So many projects, so little time, Paul. Shout out to the 100 or so subscribers who have come on board lately via Kiwi Blog. You are certainly amongst friends here. I remain heavily reliant on nice people to promote my channel. So tell your mates about this way cool channel on YouTube. Perhaps even suggest this one. I'll do my best to keep you entertained in 10 to 15 minute segments. Check out the Doomsday Prophecy and the South Pole Pyramid videos as well. Links below. And now you'll see why by the age of 16 I was already a third Dan in sarcasm. Bye for now.